Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in I Am the Truth by Henri, published by Stanford University Press in 2003, first published in France in 1996. In the first 94 pages, we were given the complete phenomenology of Henri, and then the next three chapters have been Doctrine of Man. We're now going to take a look at Part 3 of Doctrine of Man. It'll be pages 133 to 152, and it will wrap up the three-chapter section on Doctrine of Man. Let's begin with Block 1 and take a look at the absolute phenomenology of life. Henri tells us that the knowledge of myself as an individual is possessed by life alone. It is delivered to the intellect through Christianity. Secular definitions have created dismay and despair. Christianity defines self as huios. Self as huios. Member of the huioi, the children of God, generated in the absolute phenomenology of God's life. So this concept of self as huios, our selfhood, is engendered in the absolute life of God the Father. And we are empowered to become the huios of God, the child of God. Henri asks, why has man lost the notion of this true essence? He says that our spiritual birth actually contains within it the hidden reason why we have forgotten our true essence. Self does not bring itself into true essence, it is engendered within the living Father. It is engendered selfhood. Let's take a look at note 3. It rests in the coming of life into itself, the coming of God's life into himself. Our position is basically passive with regard to this coming to life unto itself, this movement of the Father and the Son. He says the me, our identity, is continually self-affected. Transcendental birth takes place within the selfhood of the absolute life, against the background of the original selfhood as the ark Son, Jesus Christ. So we are embraced by and influenced by and informed by, note 4, the original selfhood of the ark Son. Possessing selfhood includes possessing each of the powers, or the dunamis, potentiality of the power. With the ability to exercise these powers, we're given a new capacity, and these new capacities become the components of our real identity, our real being in Christ. So if we look at these components of real being, they include powers of the mind, where we form the eidos ideas, and the power to desire the kingdom. These powers become our pathos experience in Christ. Then these powers to form the eidos ideas leads to an ability to act in positing and in praxis. So we do move from transcendental birth to the formation of the eidos ideas of kingdom, and from the formation of the eidos ideas of kingdom, we move on to positing and to praxis, or the ability to act, which he calls the power to act in note 6. From transcendental birth, we transition to possession of selfhood, and then we transition to ability to act through the powers of the body and the powers of the mind. The opening of a new field of experience for the self, beginning with new interior experience, where we are indwelt by the selfhood and the personhood of Christ. It's all about this brand new interior experience in note 7. It is the power at the self's disposition. The self can deploy its powers, but the self is powerless in the sense that this power is only given to the self within the absolute life of God the Father and the original selfhood of Christ. John 15:5 tells us, apart from me, you can do nothing. So yes, we have the ability to act. out of this transcendental birth, but it is within this transcendental birth that we act. That is where that power resides. So we take a look at this powerlessness in John 15:5 and note 8. All power consists in the self of the ark Son. John 19:10 through 11. You would have no power if it were not given to you from above. Power is deployed in the self-givenness of the absolute life of the Father. And then Philippians 2:13, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. Our movement toward praxis is a movement within God the Father, within his movement. And his movement includes his embracing of the Son who embraces us as huios, or as huioi, as children of God. So that gives us our theoretical position. Now we're ready to move on to Block 2. Now in Block 2, we'll take a look at the real self, which equals self as huios, child of God. We begin with dunamis power. The condition of the self is the center of our ability to act, belonging to the self as its very real being. Through enlisting its dunamis power, to act means to operate, it means the operation of power, which is our act of freedom, says Henri. It's the act of freedom in Christ. So under this notion of the act of freedom, the self in Christ is not subject to worldly laws because of the manner in which we take possession of our dunamis power. Through positing and praxis, the self experiences itself in this newfound freedom, and that constitutes our selfhood. Through assuming the origin of our selfhood in the absolute life, that is, remember, a radical reciprocal interiority between the Father and the Son. So our concrete selfhood is in the absolute life of the Father and the Son in their reciprocal interiority. In note 3, we identify the effective active being of absolute life. Selfhood therefore becomes felt as our responsibility, but the self must guard against forgetting that even our faith is situated in the effectivity of God's absolute life. Faith is a gift. This forgetting would be equal to what Henri calls transcendental illusion. The illusion that we are the power, that we are our own self-identity. This is a transcendental illusion. That's forgetting Christ. That's forgetting the Father. That's forgetting their reciprocal interiority of fellowship between the Father and the Son. So we are to negate the transcendental illusion in note 5. Forgetting our condition as huioi equals transcendental illusion of egoism, because the source of dunamis power is the self-givenness of God's absolute life. By forgetting our condition as huioi, we become interested in the secular world outside our real self, which leads to coveting worldly goods. False self becomes identified with worldly goods. So we'll take a look at this notion of false identity in note 6. False identity is egoism. It is a projecting toward an unreal self. It is established in world truth rather than life's truth, never reaching anything but a phantom self. Real identity equals a relation generated in the original selfhood of life, that is, Jesus Christ. So he wants to wrap up the concrete block with becoming real self. And Henri tells us that the fundamental presupposition of Christianity is that it concerns the aletheia divine truth, which transcends the notion of simply being in the world. The real self is preoccupied with that which is other. We set aside egoism and identify with self as huios, as the man who is not of the world, the self who is not of the world. This is a selfhood hidden with Christ. We're going to take a look at that in block 3. So we've taken a look at the theoretical notion that even our faith is a gift of the self-affecting life of the Father, and that our self as huios is established in the Son, and now in block 3, selfhood as hidden with Christ. In John 4, 5, and 6, Christ says, they are of the world, therefore speak they of the world, and the world hears them. This is John in 1 John. We are of God. He that knows God hears us. By this we know the spirit of truth, and we know the spirit of error. John the Beloved is telling us that in Christ we can distinguish spirit of truth from spirit of error. We are to set our minds on things above as our motivation of life. From Colossians 3, 2 and 3, set your affections on things above, for you are dead and your life is hidden with Christ in God. And that is the way that Paul puts it. Hidden with Christ in the Father. I love that. So it's exactly what Henri is telling us here in this manuscript. Our identity is with Christ in the Father. Our lives are hidden with Christ in the absolute life of the Father. So the setting of affections in note 2, our capacity for egoism has been dislocated, deactivated. Egoism only possesses a world empty of reality. It ends up becoming covetousness. James 4:3, you ask, and you receive not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts, asking out of wrong motivation. Thus, we view the contrast of the two treasures, the treasure of the world and the treasure built into the life of God. Selfhood as built in God's life. Note 3, Christ said, I am praying not for the world, in John 17:9. In Luke 11:23, he that gathers not with me scattereth. He that gathers not with me, he that is not embraced by me, scattereth. Life means light, spiritual light, and the world means spiritual darkness. In Matthew 8:23, if the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? So, for Henri, his conclusion is in block 3, note 4, life means spiritual light, the light of spiritual truth, the aletheia truth. Beware, the self allows itself to be forgotten in egoism. To think is to relate oneself as intentionality in life. The self is never placed at a distance from the self. Life means forgetting the egoistic self, negating the egoistic self. So, if we take a look at note 5, life and forgetting the egoistic self. Our condition as huios abbreviates 3 relations. Negation. Negate egoism. And then 2, going out of the self as the relation of the self to the essential life of Christ. And then the return moment of the relation of life to itself. All 3 relations draw from the essence of life in Christ, from the immemorial generation of life in that reciprocal interiority of the Father and Son. So we negate egoism, we go out of ourself in our communion with Christ and His identity, His personhood, and then we are taken up in the return moment of the Father Himself, who is resurrecting us and lifting us up out of ourselves into restored union with the Father. So it's all about this restored union. So if you take a look at note 6, block 3, note 6, our identity comes into itself only within the self of the absolute life of the Father, in the process of eternal self-generation, as a life process that preceded the world and its time. Our spiritual rebirth means to find once again the condition that once was our own. to that originary position of being created within the self-affecting life of God Himself, and that reciprocal interiority between the Father and the Son. That wraps up Part 3 of the Doctrine of Man. That was pages 133 to 152. And we're going to pick up next time in page 153.